The spring of 1870 clung to Bitterroot Hollow, a hardscrabble trading post in Montana Territory, where the air was thick with the tang of pine pitch, mule dung, and the faint bite of cheap whiskey. Dust swirled lazily under a merciless sun coating. The boots of men gathered around a rickety auction block, splintered boards, propped on whiskey barrels, creaking under the weight of desperation. Trappers, miners, and drifters, their faces carved by wind and want, stood shoulder to shoulder, hands rough, eyes hollow, hearts hungry for something they couldn't name. A man in a tattered preacher's coat, his collar frayed and stained, banged a gavel against a post, his voice slicing through the murmurs like a dull blade. "Step right up, gents. Last soul for sale today, a woman, no name, no face. Head covered in sackcloth since she crossed the divide. She'll cook, mend, marry if you're bold enough to claim her. Biddin' starts at $2. Who's got the grit to take the mystery?" The crowd erupted in coarse laughter, tobacco spit hitting the dirt. "What's under that sack?" "A banshee," one man hollered, his beard flecked with ash, "might as well wed the damn sack." Another jeered, elbowing his neighbor. On the auction block stood a lone figure, barefoot, her hands bound with coarse, fraying rope, a burlap sack tied tightly over her head, stained with sweat and road dust. Her breaths came quick, shallow, like a deer caught in a trap, the sack trembling with each inhale. Her fingers twitched, clenching and unclenching, betraying a fear she fought to hide. The preacher's eyes narrowed, his patience thin. $2. Come on now. She ain't worth a dime if she won't even speak. The jeers grew louder, but no hands rose. Men shuffled, some turning away, muttering about curses or bad luck. A long minute stretched, heavy as the heat, until the crowd parted like a river, split by stone. From the back, a tall figure strode forward, his broad shoulders filling out a worn canvas coat, his face shadowed beneath a gray Stetson, weathered but clean. His boots, heavy with trail mud, ground dust with each deliberate step. Elias Kane, a lumberjack from the northern ridges, stood out like a lone pine in a barren field. His flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, revealing arms scarred from years. "Wrestling timber, $2, Elias said, his voice low, steady, like the slow creak of a tree before it falls. Silence blanketed the crowd, thick and sudden, as if the wind itself held its breath. The preacher squinted, scratching his grizzled chin. "You sure, Kane? You don't even know what you're buying." Elias tilted his head toward the woman, still as stone under the sack, her bound hands steady now, as if his voice had anchored her. "Don't need to see a face to know a person's worth," he said, the words cutting through the jeers like a blade through hide. The crowd stilled, their laughter dying in their throats. Even the preacher faltered, his gavel hovering. "Name for the record," he muttered, thrusting a crumpled paper forward. "Elias Kane, lumberman, Bitterroot Hollow." Elias signed, with a slow, deliberate hand, his eyes never leaving the woman. "Your name, miss." The preacher snapped, impatient. The sack shifted, just enough to hint at movement beneath. A hush fell, and then, soft as a whisper carried on the wind, her voice came, clear and steady despite its quiet. "Miriam Holt." The name struck Elias like a lightning bolt splitting a tree. His hand froze mid-signature, his breath catching. 3 winters ago, in a snow-choked pass high in the Bitterroot Mountains, he'd been trapped under a fallen log, blood seeping into the snow, his leg broken, the cold stealing his life breath by breath. A woman had appeared, her face hidden by a tattered scarf, her voice low and fearless as she cut him free, dragging him to a shallow cave. She'd built a fire, fed him bitter broth of pine bark, and stayed until dawn, vanishing with the first light, leaving only a carved wooden pendant in his hand, a small, intricate hawk, its wings spread. That voice, that same voice, echoed, now in the dust of Bitterroot Hollow. Miriam Holt, a name he'd never known until this moment. Elias's eyes, dark as the earth after rain, flickered with recognition, but he held his tongue. His heart pounded, memories of that frozen night flooding back, the crackle of the fire, the warmth of her hands, the quiet strength in her words. The preacher, oblivious, grunted, "You're wed, legal under God and Montana law. Take her and go." Elias stepped onto the block, his boots thudding softly, He reached for Miriam's arm, his touch gentle but firm, like he was steadying a sapling in a storm. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice a promise more than a command. She nodded, the sack fluttering with her breath, and followed him down. The crowd parted, silent now, watching as they walked away, dust swirling around their steps. Her name a spark in the dry air, they moved toward the edge of town, where the trail dipped into a pine-shadowed valley, the Bitterroot Mountains looming, jagged and silent, guarding secrets older than the land. Elias led a mule laden with supplies, a sack of flour, a coil of rope, a tin of coffee, his grip tight on the reins, his eyes scanning the horizon. Miriam walked beside him, her bare feet careful on the rocky path, the sack still hiding her face. Her bound hands steady now. The town's noise faded, replaced by the rustle of pines and the distant call of a hawk. Elias's cabin wasn't. Far a sturdy log structure nestled against a rocky rise, its stone chimney trailing faint smoke, a single lantern glowing in the window. He stopped at the door, turning to Miriam. "You're free to choose your place here," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of a man who'd known loss and found purpose in small acts of kindness. "No one's gonna tell you where to stand, not anymore." Miriam paused, the sack trembling slightly, and stepped inside, her silence louder than words, a fragile bridge between their past and the mystery of what lay ahead. The trail to Elias Kane's cabin wound through a valley of towering pines, where the air grew cool and heavy with the scent of sap and damp earth. Bitterroot Hollow faded behind them, its dust and jeers swallowed by the Montana wilderness. Elias led the way, his broad frame steady as he guided a mule laden with supplies, a sack of flour, a coil of rope, a tin of coffee, his gray Stetson casting a shadow over his scarred forearms. Miriam Holt followed, her bare feet careful on the rocky path, the burlap sack still tied over her head, fluttering with each breath. Her hands, though bound, moved with a quiet grace, adjusting the sack when a gust of wind tugged at it. Elias glanced back once, his dark brown eyes catching the faint tremble in her fingers. But he said nothing, letting the silence between them settle like dust after a storm. It wasn't awkward, it was the kind of quiet born from lives that had seen too much to waste words. They reached the cabin as dusk painted the Bitterroot Mountains in hues of indigo and gold. The structure was modest but solid, built from dark pine logs, its stone chimney puffing faint smoke into the evening sky. A rusted lantern hung above the door, swaying gently, casting a warm glow across the porch. Elias tethered the mule, then pushed open the door with a soft creak, stepping aside. "This is home," he said, his voice low, steady like the hum of a distant river. "You choose where you stand, Miriam. No one's gonna force you to be anywhere you don't want." Miriam paused at the threshold, the sack shifting slightly as she tilted her head. As if testing the weight of his words, she stepped inside, her movements cautious but deliberate, and chose a spot by the far wall, crouching low, hands resting on her knees. The sack stayed on, a barrier between her and the world. But her breathing slowed, steadier now. Elias moved to the iron stove, its surface worn from years of use, and began preparing a meal. The cabin filled with the scent of simmering beans, smoked venison, and a pinch of wild sage he'd gathered from the ridge. He worked in silence, his hands moving with the rhythm of a man who'd cooked alone for years, yet there was a care in his motions, as if he'd done this for someone else once. He set a wooden bowl near Miriam, not too close, and placed another on the small table, where a second bowl already steamed, untouched. "I call it ridge stew," he said, stirring his own portion. "Made it after long days in the timber, always. Set out to bowls, even when it was just me. Habit from when my sister, Ruth, was still around." His voice caught, just for a moment, before he continued. "She'd sit there, tell me stories of the stars, kept me from feeling like the woods had swallowed me whole." Miriam's head tilted slightly, the sack catching the lantern light. She didn't speak, but her fingers grazed the bowl, hesitant. Elias sat at the table, eating slowly, his eyes on his food, giving her space. After a long pause, her voice came, muffled but clear, like a stream breaking through ice. "What happened to her?" she asked, so soft he almost missed it. Elias's spoon paused midair, his jaw tightening. Ruth got sick, years back. Fever took her before I could get her to a doctor. I was off cutting timber, thinking I was building a life for us. Came back too late. He set the spoon down, his eyes distant. That second bowl's for her, I guess. A way to say I'm still here, still carrying her. Miriam's hands stilled, and for a moment, the cabin held only the crackle of the fire and the weight of shared loss. She reached for the bowl, her movements slow, deliberate, lifting the spoon under the sack without removing it. Each bite was careful, but she ate, finishing the meal in silence. Elias watched the fire, not her, letting the moment breathe. When he cleared the bowls, washing them in a tin basin, Miriam spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't ask why I wear this," she said, touching the sack's edge. Elias turned, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Figure you'll tell me when you're ready. Or not. Ain't my place to demand your story." She nodded, the sack shifting, and settled back against the wall, her knees drawn up, no longer trembling, but still guarded. As night fell, Elias sat by the stove, the fire casting long shadows across the pine walls. He pulled a small wooden pendant from his pocket, the hawk carving from that frozen night. 3 years ago, its wings, etched with care, gleamed in the firelight. He didn't know why Miriam hid her face, but that voice, her voice stirred memories of a woman who'd saved him without asking for thanks. He glanced at Miriam, now curled on a blanket by the wall, the sack still in place, her breathing steady in sleep. The pendant weighed heavy in his hand, a question he wasn't ready to ask, a truth he wasn't sure she'd share. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying the promise of secrets yet to unfold. Night draped Bitterroot Hollow like a heavy quilt, the Montana pines whispering secrets as the wind curled through their branches. Inside Elias Kane's cabin, the fire in the iron stove cast a warm glow across the pine walls, shadows dancing like memories. Too restless to settle, Elias sat by the hearth, his broad frame hunched, his gray Stetson resting on the table beside a tin cup of coffee gone cold. His dark brown eyes traced the flames, but his mind was elsewhere. 3 winters ago, in a snow-choked pass high in the Bitterroot Mountains, he'd been hauling timber, pushing too far into the wild, when a log snapped, pinning him to the frozen ground. Blood soaked the snow, his leg shattered, the cold stealing his breath. A woman had found him, her face hidden by a tattered scarf, her voice low and steady as she cut the log free, dragging him to a cave. She'd fed him bitter pine broth, kept the fire alive, and vanished by dawn, leaving only a carved wooden pendant, a hawk with wings spread, etched with care. That voice haunted him now, mirrored in the woman who slept across the room. Miriam Holt lay curled on a blanket by the far wall, the burlap sack still tied over her head, her breathing soft but uneven, as if dreams carried her to places she'd rather not go. Elias's fingers brushed the pendant in his pocket, its edges worn from years of quiet handling. He didn't know why she hid her face, but her voice, soft, measured, fearless, was the same that had pulled him back from death. He hadn't spoken of it, not yet. The weight of her silence, her choice to keep the sack, told him she wasn't ready to share her story. But the pendant burned in his hand, a question he couldn't ignore. He rose, adding a log to the fire, and glanced at her. "You don't owe me nothin'," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "But I owe you." Morning broke with a pale light filtering through the cabin's single window, the Bitterroot Mountains standing sentinel under a sky streaked with gray. Elias was outside, splitting wood with steady swings of his axe, the rhythm grounding him. Miriam stepped onto the porch, the sack still in place, but her steps were firmer, less hesitant. She moved to a lone cedar at the edge of the clearing, its branches heavy with dew, and sat at its base, her hands resting on the sack as if testing its weight. Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes catching the way she tilted her head toward the rising sun. He set the axe down and approached, stopping a respectful distance away. "I ain't one for pryin'," he said, his voice low, like the rumble of a distant storm. "But 3 years back, I was dyin' in the snow. A woman saved me face. Hidden, voice like yours, left me this." He pulled the pendant from his pocket, holding it up. the hawk catching the light. Miriam's hands froze on the sack, her breath hitching. She didn't speak, but the sack shifted, as if her eyes were locked on the pendant. Elias continued, his voice steady but soft. She didn't give her name, didn't ask for thanks, just kept me alive and left. I've carried this ever since, hoping one day I'd find her. He paused, watching her. Your voice. Miriam, it's hers. I'd know it anywhere. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of truth. Miriam's fingers tightened on the sack, then slowly loosened. She didn't remove it, but her voice came, quiet but clear, like a stream finding its way through stone. I didn't think you'd remember, she said. I didn't want you to. Elias's heart thudded, but he kept his distance, letting her words settle. Why not? He asked, not demanding, just needing to understand. Miriam's hands dropped to her lap, the sack fluttering. Some things are better left in the dark, she whispered. I saved you because it was right, not because I wanted to be known. She stood, her frame small but unyielding, and turned toward the cabin, pausing at the door. You gave me a home, Elias. That's more than I've had in years. But don't ask me to be someone I ain't ready to be. She stepped inside, leaving the pendant's question unanswered, the cedar's shadow stretching long behind her. Elias stood alone, the pendant heavy in his hand. He didn't follow her, didn't push. The forest around him hummed with life birds calling. Wind rustling, but a new weight settled in his chest. Miriam was more than a stranger under a sack. She was a piece of his past, a debt he couldn't repay with silence. As he returned to his axe, the sound of hoof beats echoed faintly from the trail beyond the ridge. A shadow moved in the distance, too far to see clearly, but Elias's instincts sharpened. Trouble was coming to Bitterroot Hollow, and it wore the dust of the Oregon Trail. The Bitterroot Mountains stood like silent sentinels over the valley, their jagged peaks catching the last threads of daylight as dusk settled over Elias Kane's cabin. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and the faint tang of sage from the morning's meal. Elias sat at the table, his broad hands polishing the blade of his axe, the carved hawk pendant resting beside a flickering lantern. His dark brown eyes, shadowed under his gray Stetson, flickered toward Miriam Holt, who stood by the window, the burlap sack still tied over her head, her silhouette framed against the fading light. Her hands, no longer bound, clutched the windowsill, steady but tense, as if she sensed the same unease that had prickled Elias's spine since the distant hoof beats echoed from the trail the day before. The forest was too quiet tonight, the kind of quiet that warned of a storm brewing beyond the pines. Miriam turned from the window, the sack shifting slightly. Someone's out there, she said, her voice low, steady, but laced with a fear she couldn't hide. Elias set the axe down, his jaw tightening. Heard him yesterday, he said, rising to his feet. Rider, moving slow, watchin', ain't no logger or trapper. He grabbed his Winchester from the wall, checking the chamber with a practiced hand. Stay inside. Miriam, bolt the door if I ain't back by dark. She nodded, the sack trembling with her breath. But before she could speak, a sharp knock rattled the door. 3 deliberate taps, not asking, but demanding. Elias motioned for Miriam to step back, his hand hovering near his Colt as he opened the door a crack. A woman stood on the porch, her dark skin glowing under the lantern light, her dress patched but clean, a woven shawl draped over her shoulders. Her eyes, warm but wary, met Elias's. Name's Tessa Reed, she said, her voice steady despite the cold. Used to run a boarding house in Missoula. I know her. She nodded toward Miriam, who stood frozen in the shadows. And I know why she hides. Elias's grip tightened on the door, his eyes narrowing. Speak plain, ma'am, he said, not unkindly but firm. Tessa's gaze didn't waver. There's a man huntin' her, a bounty hunter. Calls himself Gideon Voss. He's a skin questions in town, sayin' Miriam's a fugitive, wanted for murder back in Idaho. I came to warn you. Miriam's breath hitched, the sack fluttering as she stepped forward. I ain't a murderer, she whispered, her voice raw, breaking the silence like a stone through glass. Tessa's eyes softened, but she held her ground. I believe you, Miriam. I was there, in Missoula, when it happened. I saw what that man tried to do to you. Elias's heart pounded. the pendant in his pocket suddenly heavy. He opened the door wider, letting Tessa inside. "Tell us," he said, his voice low, urgent. Miriam sank onto a chair, her hands clutching. "The sack," as Tessa began to speak. 3 years ago, in a Missoula boarding house, Miriam worked as a cook, her days filled with flour dust and the clatter of pots. The owner, a man named Harlan Creed, had a reputation for taking what wasn't offered. One night, he cornered Miriam in the kitchen, his hands rough, his demands clear. She fought back, shoving him away, and he fell, his head striking the stoves. Iron edge, he didn't get up. The town branded her a killer, a temptress who'd lured him to his death. They covered her face with a sack, sold her off to pay his debts, passing her from trader to trader until she reached Bitterroot Hollow. Tessa, a worker at the boarding house, had seen it all but stayed silent, fearing for her own life. "I was a coward," Tessa admitted, her voice breaking. "But I'm here now, and I'll speak the truth if you let me." Miriam's hands trembled, the sack shifting as she stood. "They took everything from me," she said, her voice a mix of pain and defiance. "My name, my freedom, my face." She reached up, her fingers brushing the knot at her neck, and then, in a single, deliberate motion, she untied the sack, letting it fall to the floor. A long, jagged scar ran from her temple to her jaw, deep and permanent. A mark of that night in Missoula. Her eyes, gray as a winter storm, met Elias's, unyielding but raw. "He did this when I said no," she said. "I fought to live, not to kill." Elias's breath caught, the pendant burning in his pocket. He saw not just the scar, but the woman who'd saved him, who'd chosen to fight then and now. The plot twist landed like a thunderclap. Tessa's rival wasn't just a warning but a chance at redemption. She pulled a folded letter from her shawl, her hands steady. "I wrote it all down what I saw. What Harlan did. It's signed, ready for the judge and Helena. But Voss is close, Elias. He'll be here by dawn." Elias nodded, his mind racing. "Then we move tonight," he said, his voice hard as iron. He turned to Miriam, his eyes softening. "You don't gotta hide no more, but if you want to fight, I'm with you." Miriam's gaze held his, a flicker of trust breaking through her fear. "I'm tired of running," she said, her voice steady now. Tessa stepped forward, placing a hand on Miriam's shoulder. "You ain't alone anymore," she said as the lantern's light dimmed. Elias grabbed his coat, the pendant still in his pocket, its hawk wings a silent vow. The hoof beats were closer now, echoing through the pines, a shadow creeping toward Bitterroot Hollow. Miriam picked up the sack from the floor, folding it carefully, not as a mask but as a relic of a past she was ready to face. The three of them stood together, bound by a truth that could either save them or bury them under the weight of the frontier's unforgiving justice. The Bitterroot Mountains loomed dark and unyielding as midnight swallowed the valley, the pines whispering warnings in the cold Montana air. Inside Elias Kane's cabin, the lantern's glow flickered, casting shadows across the pine walls. Elias, his gray Stetson pulled low, checked his Winchester, his dark brown eyes sharp with resolve. Miriam Holt stood by the table, the burlap sack folded in her hands, her gray eyes fierce under the scar that ran from temple to jaw. Tessa Reed, her shawl tight around her shoulders, clutched the affidavit that could clear Miriam's name, her face set with determination. The hoof beats of Gideon Voss, the bounty hunter, echoed closer now, a relentless drumbeat through the forest. Elias glanced at Miriam, his voice steady as iron. "We end this tonight, Miriam. You ain't running no more." She nodded, her grip on the sack tightening, not as a shield but as a weapon she'd chosen to wield. Their plan was simple but perilous. Miriam would ride out, the sack over her head, luring Voss to the old logging trail where Elias and Tessa would wait with the town sheriff. Miriam mounted Elias's bay mare, her muslin dress catching the moonlight, the sack tied loosely to mimic her past captivity. "I choose this," she said, her voice clear, no longer a whisper. Elias handed her the hawk pendant, its carved wings glinting. "For luck," he said. She tucked it into her pocket, her scarred face resolute, and rode into the dark, the pines closing around her like a vow. Elias and Tessa took the high trail, moving swiftly to the ambush point. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Holtby, waiting with 2 deputies, their rifles ready. The night held its breath, the stars above cold and watchful. Voss took the bait, his lean frame cutting through the fog, his gray duster flapping as he tracked Miriam's horse. He was a shadow, relentless, his eyes glinting like steel as he followed her to the logging trail. Where fallen timber and rocky outcrops formed a natural trap, Miriam dismounted. Standing alone in the clearing, the sack over her head, her hands steady, Voss slowed, his hand on his revolver, a smirk curling his lips. "No more runnin', girl," he called, stepping closer. "Harlan Creed's blood's on your hands, and I'm here to collect." Miriam's voice, muffled but defiant, cut through the night. "You're chassin' a lie, Voss. I fought to live, not to kill." He laughed, cold and sharp, but before he could draw, Elias's voice rang out from the shadows. "Drop it, Voss." The bounty hunter spun, but he was too late. Elias, Tessa, and the sheriff emerged from the pines, rifles trained. Voss froze, his hand hovering, then dropped his gun, his smirk fading. "You're harboring a fugitive, Kane," he snarled. Tessa stepped forward, holding up the affidavit. "This says different," she said, her voice unwavering. "I saw what happened in Missoula. Miriam didn't murder nobody. Harlan Creed attacked her, and his death was his own doing." Sheriff Holtby, his badge glinting, read the affidavit under the lantern light, his face hardening. "This checks out," he said. "Voss, you're under arrest for unlawful pursuit." The deputies bound Voss's hands, his curses swallowed by the night as they led him away. Miriam untied the sack, letting it fall to the ground, her scarred face bare under the moonlight. She looked at Elias, her gray eyes shining with something. "New freedom. I didn't think I'd ever stop running," she said, her voice breaking. Elias stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "You don't gotta run alone no more," he said, his words a quiet vow. Tessa smiled, her shawl slipping as she nodded. "You got folks who see you." Miriam, the real you. The pendant in Miriam's pocket felt warm, a reminder of the night she'd saved Elias, and now, the night they'd saved her. Weeks later, a letter arrived from Helena, sealed with the judge's mark. Elias opened it on the cabin porch, Miriam standing beside him, her hair loose, the scar no longer hidden. The charges against her were dropped, her name cleared. She walked to the cedar tree where she'd first faced the sun, the pendant in her hand. "I saved you because it was right," she said, her voice soft but strong. "But you saved me because you saw me." Elias's eyes softened, his Stetson tilted back. "I saw you then, and I see you now," he said. "Always will." Spring bloomed in Bitterroot Hollow, the pines alive with new buds, the air sweet with wildflowers. Elias and Miriam stood under a simple wooden arch by the cabin, their hands joined. Tessa and a few townsfolk gathered. Miriam wore a cream muslin dress, a scarf woven from the sackcloth draped over her shoulders, its edges embroidered with tiny hawks. Her choice, her story. They vowed to stand together, not erasing the past, but reclaiming it. The plot twist had been their salvation, Tessa's courage, Miriam's truth, and Elias's faith had turned a fugitive's flight into a homecoming. The history of Montana's frontier towns like Bitterroot Hollow is woven with tales of outcasts and redemption, where women like Miriam faced harsh judgments but found strength in community. In the 1870s, mail-order brides were often women escaping pasts, seeking new lives in a land that could be as cruel as it was hopeful. Their stories remind us that justice and love can bloom, even in the harshest soils, when truth finds a voice. Thank you for riding through this tale of courage and heart in the Wild West. If Miriam and Elias's story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more frontier adventures. Tell us in the comments, would you stand up for someone like Miriam, even if it meant facing the whole town? Let's hear your thoughts.